My name is Evelyn Esther. I am 32 years old from Arizona, and last month I learned the true price of family. Behind my back, my parents cut me out of their will to leave everything to my older brother. Yet they still cried to me every single month, begging me to pay their house mortgage to save the family home. At their 40th anniversary dinner, in front of 50 cheering guests, my brother stood up, raised his glass, and announced he would be taking over the estate. He looked right at me, smiling like I was just their ATM. I did not cause a scene. I simply finished my red wine, smiled back, and placed a bank-stamped legal folder right onto the center table. It was the buyout deed. Before I tell you how I legally foreclosed on my own family, welcome back to the channel. Hit like, subscribe, and drop a comment with your age and where you are watching from tonight. Now let me take you back to how this trap was set. The conflict did not begin with malice. It started with my own fatal flaw. I had a desperate need to buy my parents' approval. 2 years ago, my parents, Thomas and Linda, faced losing their home. My older brother, David, was a professional failure who specialized in spending other people's money. When his latest venture collapsed, he didn't look for a job. He simply moved his entire family into my parents' basement and waited for a rescue. As a certified public accountant, I had the capital. I wanted to be the hero. I did not just pay their arrears. I sat down with their lender and legally purchased the promissory note to protect them. I became their bank. For 24 months, I secretly absorbed their $1,800 monthly payments. I structured it so they would not feel the financial burden, allowing them to maintain their pride in front of their friends. I shielded them from reality. I trained them to believe my sacrifices were just part of the natural order. The reality check arrived during tax season. Because I prepare their filings every April, my mother sent me an email containing their standard deduction receipts. She is not great with technology. She forwarded a chain message instead of a new draft. I opened the attachment, expecting the usual mess of scanned receipts. Instead, the screen filled with a legal thread that made the air in my office feel thin. My mother hadn't just sent me tax files, she had accidentally forwarded her soul. My eyes locked onto the bolded subject line, finalized distribution of estate. I scrolled, my hand trembling slightly on the mouse, until I hit the paragraph that mattered. My name was gone. It had been scrubbed clean from the future of the home I was currently buying for them. In its place, in every line and every clause, was David. The wording was clear and legally binding. Upon their passing, the family home, the very home I was silently financing every 30 days, would transfer entirely to David. I printed the email, folded it into my pocket, and drove across town to their house. I found my mother in the kitchen, wiping down the counters. I placed the folded paper on the island. I did not yell. I asked her to explain why my name was removed from the estate. My mother stopped wiping the counter. She did not defend herself with anger. She cried quietly, leaning against the sink. She didn't even look guilty, she looked practical. She patted my hand and told me that since I was successful and single, I had plenty of life left to build my own wealth. But David, she whispered, David was fragile. She spoke about my brother's children, as if their existence canceled out my right to my own earnings. In her eyes, my strength was not a trait to be proud of. It was a resource to be mined for his benefit. She genuinely believed my financial stability meant I did not need their loyalty. In her mind, she was just balancing the scales. I stood in the kitchen, listening to the refrigerator hum. I looked at the woman who raised me. They were using my silent monthly sacrifices to fund my brother's inheritance. I was paying for the house he was going to own. I nodded, picked up the paper, and walked out the front door without saying another word. The next morning I drove downtown to the office of my real estate attorney. Heavy rain lashed against the windshield of my car. The rhythmic thumping of the wiper blades was the only sound inside the cabin. A low rumble of thunder vibrated through the steering wheel. I parked and walked into the tall glass building. I sat in the leather chair, my posture as rigid as the columns outside. I didn't look at the photos of my parents on my phone. I only looked at the amortization schedule. Every payment I had made was a red cell on my spreadsheet, a debt of loyalty that they had already defaulted on. I slid the original promissory note across the desk. I wasn't a daughter in that moment. I was a senior creditor closing a bad account. My attorney placed the thick property file on his heavy mahogany desk. The dull thud of the paper echoed in the quiet room. Arizona operates under a deed of trust system for real estate financing. Foreclosing on a primary residence is not a simple matter of changing the locks or issuing an eviction notice. It requires cold and calculated legal precision. I instructed him to call the loan due in full. The scratch of his fountain pen on the legal pad was the only sound between us. The heavy ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner measured the silence. He drafted the formal notice of default. The law required a rigid 90-day waiting period before any public auction could take place. A legal clock started ticking the moment the ink dried on that paper. I stepped out of the law office and let the freezing rain soak through my blazer. I didn't care about the cold. For 2 years, I had been their bank, their daughter, and their secret savior. Now, I was just a creditor collecting what was owed. The 90-day clock wasn't just for a house. It was the countdown to the end of a lie I had been telling myself for a lifetime. I knew the resistance would test every boundary I had ever built. 1 week later, the certified mail was finally signed for at my childhood home. I knew the exact minute it happened because my attorney's office sent me an automated notification. I expected a phone call or perhaps a lawyer's letter in return. I did not expect what happened 2 hours later. I was sitting at my desk, reviewing a client portfolio. The ambient hum of the office ventilation was a steady comfort. Outside my window, the sky was still dark with storm clouds. Then the heavy footsteps started echoing from the stairwell. David had driven straight to my accounting firm. He stomped up the stairs, moving forcefully from the bottom floor up to my second-level office. His boots hit each step with heavy and erratic thuds. The metal railing rattled under his grip. He pushed open my glass door. The hinges whined in protest. He stood in the center of my office, breathing heavily. His chest heaved up and down. His face was flushed red with heat and entitlement. He did not say a single word. I did not let him. I just stared at him. He slammed the crumpled legal notice onto my desk. The paper slapped loudly against the polished wood. He let out a breathless and mocking laugh. It was a sound of pure disbelief. He pointed a shaking finger at the document and then at me. His heavy breathing filled the small room. He was waiting for me to break. He was waiting for me to apologize and explain it was a misunderstanding. I picked up my coffee mug and took a slow sip. The ceramic clinked gently against the stone coaster. I looked back at my computer monitor. The quiet click of my computer mouse pierced the silence. The silence suffocated him. The realization that I was not going to engage in a screaming match broke his rhythm. He scoffed loudly. It was a harsh and guttural sound. He turned around and kicked the metal trash can by the door. The loud clang echoed down the hallway. He stormed back down the stairs, leaving the crumpled notice behind. The sound of his truck tires screeching out of the parking lot faded into the distance. The emotional resistance from my parents took a different form. They did not use anger. They used guilt. Later that week, another heavy storm rolled through the valley. The wind whistled through the gaps in my apartment windows. The rain drummed relentlessly against the roof. I looked out the living room window and saw my parents' sedan parked in my driveway. The engine was running. The windshield wipers scraped back and forth across the glass. They sat in the front seats, staring up at my second-floor window. My mother held a crumpled tissue to her face. Even through the heavy rain, I could see her shoulders shaking. She was crying. She was sobbing quietly into her hands. The rhythmic motion of her grief was visible through the fogged glass. My father sat gripping the steering wheel. He let out deep and heavy sighs. They were waiting for me to come down in the rain. They wanted me to stand in the cold and comfort them. They wanted to use my own empathy as leverage to force me into dropping the foreclosure. I stood behind the glass and watched the rain fall. The wind rattled the window panes. A flash of lightning illuminated the dark street. A loud crack of thunder shook the floorboards beneath my feet. I did not go downstairs. I reached out and closed the blinds. The sound of the plastic slats snapping shut was final. I turned my back to the window and walked into the kitchen. The quiet hum of the refrigerator was my only company. The heaviest blow came from inside my own home. My fiancé Marcus had watched this entire process unfold. He watched me coldly calculate the foreclosure of my childhood home. He watched me compile the ledgers and track the 90-day timeline on a spreadsheet. That evening the apartment was quiet. The storm outside had settled into a steady and quiet drizzle. Marcus walked into the bedroom. He pulled his canvas duffel bag from the top shelf of the closet. The heavy zipper sounded like tearing fabric in the silent room. He began placing his clothes into the bag. The soft rustle of denim and cotton filled the space. The squeak of his sneakers on the hardwood floor marked his path back and forth across the room. I stood in the doorway, my arms crossed, watching him pack. Every time he looked at me, I countered his sadness with a mental list of my bank statements. He didn't see a woman standing up for herself. He saw a fortress with no doors. When he looked at me one last time, his eyes searched for a crack in my armor, a single tear, a reason to stay. I gave him nothing but a steady gaze. He didn't just leave. He retreated from a person he no longer recognized. He looked at me with a profound sadness. He saw my obsession with fairness turning me into someone unrecognizable. He could not understand the years of silent financial bleeding I had endured. He only saw the rigid accountant foreclosing on her own family over money. He zipped the bag closed. The metal teeth locked together with a harsh scrape. He picked up the bag by the handles. The leather straps groaned under the weight. He walked past me into the kitchen. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out his apartment key. He placed the key on the granite island. The metal clinked sharply against the stone. It was a definitive and hollow sound. He walked to the front door. He paused for a fraction of a second, with his hand resting on the brass knob. He took one final deep breath. The sound of his inhale filled the entryway. He opened the door and walked out into the damp hallway. The heavy door clicked shut behind him. The deadbolt slid into place with a loud snap. I was alone in the quiet condo. I heard the distant rumble of thunder rolling over the mountains. The rain started to fall harder against the glass. The gentle tapping of water drops echoed in the empty living room. I had maintained my boundaries. I had secured my financial future. The legal machinery was moving exactly as I had planned. The 90-day clock was still ticking down toward the public auction. But the victory was already extracting a heavy toll. I walked over to the kitchen island. I picked up the metal key. The cold brass chilled the palm of my hand. I sat on a wooden stool and listened to the steady sound of my own breathing in the empty room. My legal victory was already costing my future. I was winning the war, but the collateral damage was stripping my life bare. The legal clock continued to tick. Day 30 passed. Day 45 passed. The notice of default sat active in the county records. I expected phone calls. I expected negotiations. Instead, I watched my parents choose total denial. They convinced themselves that I would blink first. They believed the daughter who spent 2 years secretly paying their bills lacked the spine to finalize an eviction. Their response to the looming foreclosure was to throw a party. The thick cardstock invitation arrived in my mailbox on a Tuesday. It was printed with shiny gold lettering. They were hosting a 40th anniversary dinner at an upscale steakhouse in Scottsdale. I knew their bank accounts were empty. I knew they were using the very last of their available credit lines to fund the illusion of a happy and prosperous family. This was their lifelong pattern. Growing up, my father always prioritized the appearance of wealth over actual stability. I remember being 12 years old and watching him park a brand new luxury sedan in the driveway on the exact same day our electricity was shut off for non-payment. He would rather sit in the dark than let the neighbors think we were struggling. My mother enabled him. She smoothed over the rough edges of his financial ruin with a warm smile and a plate of fresh cookies. They built a fortress of pretending. Now they were applying that same strategy to my foreclosure. They thought if they threw a grand enough party, the reality of their crushing debt would simply vanish into the desert air. Marcus had warned me before he left. His parting advice was to stay away and let the legal process run its course without my physical presence. I should have listened. But as the evening of the anniversary approached, a stubborn refusal took root in my chest. I refused to be erased from the family narrative. I refused to let them paint me as the villain in a room full of relatives while I hid in my apartment. I made the deeply flawed decision to attend. I put on a simple dark dress. I drove across the valley. The sky above the mountains was painted in streaks of purple and bruised orange as the sun set. I handed my keys to the valet outside the restaurant. The heavy wooden doors of the establishment opened, and the rich scent of roasted garlic and seared meat hit my face. The private dining room was situated at the very back of the restaurant. The space was lined with dark mahogany walls and lit by dim crystal chandeliers that cast long shadows across the floorboards. The tension in the air was thick the moment I stepped across the threshold. 50 guests milled around holding cocktails. Aunts, uncles, and cousins who had not spoken to me in years were laughing loudly and swapping stories. The ambient noise of clinking glassware and overlapping conversations created an impenetrable wall of sound. I stood near the entrance, holding my purse with both hands. My parents were standing at the center of the room. They were holding court like royalty. My mother wore a new silk dress that shimmered under the lights. My father wore a tailored jacket with a crisp pocket square. They looked polished and pristine. David stood right beside them. He was the focal point of their attention. My parents spent the cocktail hour parading David around like a trophy. I watched my mother adjust David's tie with a look of pure adoration, a look she hadn't given me since I graduated top of my class. My father handed David a vintage watch, an heirloom I thought was lost years ago, while praising his resilience. I stood 10 feet away, a stranger with a glass of wine, invisible in the glow of their shared delusion. My brother had failed at everything he had ever attempted. Yet my parents framed his repeated failures as noble stepping stones. They wove a narrative of a hard-working father just waiting for his big break. I walked over to the long banquet table and found my place card. I was seated at the very far edge of the table. I was isolated next to a distant cousin who spent the entire evening looking at his phone. I sat silently and watched the performance. The dinner service began. Waiters in white aprons moved seamlessly around the room. Plates of filet mignon and sea bass were placed on the white linen tablecloth. Silverware scraped loudly against porcelain. I chewed my food without tasting it. The resentment bubbled in my throat. I looked down the long expanse of the table. David was laughing loudly. He was totally ignorant of how close the foreclosure timeline actually was. My parents had clearly shielded him from the notice of default. They probably told him it was a simple legal misunderstanding that they had already handled. He sat there eating expensive steak, thinking his future was secure. He looked down the table and caught my eye. He gave me a small, arrogant nod. He saw my silence as total submission. The plates were cleared away. The waiters brought out a towering tiered cake. The room grew warm. A waiter circled the table, pouring champagne into tall crystal flutes. The liquid bubbled and hissed as it hit the glass. The psychological pressure in the room peaked. The low murmur of conversation faded away as my father stood up to thank everyone for coming. He gestured widely with his hands. He smiled for the cameras. He then turned the floor over to his eldest son. David stood up from his chair. He straightened his tie and picked up his champagne flute. He took a silver spoon and tapped it against the crystal. The sharp ringing sound cut through the remaining chatter. The room fell entirely quiet. All 50 faces turned to look at him. He puffed out his chest and rolled his shoulders back. He took a deep and theatrical breath. He delivered a smooth and patronizing speech. He did not yell. His voice was steady and filled with unearned confidence. He talked about the importance of legacy and the sacrifices parents make for their children. He announced to the cheering room that he was officially stepping up as the family patriarch. He proudly declared that he would be taking over the family estate to ensure the property remained a safe haven for future generations. He smiled widely as my father reached up and patted his arm in agreement. The guests clapped gently. My mother wiped a single tear from her cheek. David raised his glass higher. He let his gaze drift slowly down the long table until it landed directly on me. A condescending smile spread across his face. He offered a public and pitying look in my direction. He pointed toward me and spoke about how some people lose sight of what truly matters. He described me to the room as the career-obsessed sister. He shook his head slowly from side to side. He painted a picture of a sad and lonely woman who prioritized spreadsheets over blood. He told the crowd that I simply did not understand family values. The audience murmured in polite agreement. I sat at the edge of the table. I held my glass of red wine. I felt the smooth stem of the glass between my fingers. I listened to his breathing, echoing slightly in the quiet room. I let him finish. I let him build his monument of hubris right in front of everyone. David finished speaking. The polite applause rippled across the private dining room. I did not glare at him. I set my wine glass down on the white linen. The base of the crystal made a soft thud against the wood underneath the cloth. I reached into my leather tote resting by my feet. I pulled out a thick manila envelope. I stood up from my chair. The movement was slow and deliberate. I walked the length of the table. The conversation around me naturally faded as people noticed my approach. I stopped right next to my brother. I opened the clasp of the envelope and slid the document out. It was the finalized notice of trustee sale, printed on heavy stock paper, bearing the blue ink stamp of the county recorder. I placed it squarely in front of his dinner plate. He looked down at the bold text. His brow furrowed in confusion. He reached out and touched the paper as if it were written in a foreign language. I did not raise my voice. I spoke in a calm and measured tone that carried easily in the sudden quiet of the room. I explained that he could not take over the family estate. The house no longer belonged to our parents to give away. I laid out the facts. I stated that the property was scheduled for public auction in exactly 11 days to satisfy a defaulted loan. I watched his eyes scan the page, searching for a loophole. I told him the outstanding debt was $140,000. I let that number hang in the air. Then I delivered the final piece of the puzzle. I informed him that the debt was owed to the sole note holder of the property. I tapped my index finger twice on my own chest. The blood drained from his face, leaving his skin a pale shade of gray. He tried to laugh, but the sound died in his throat. He looked at our father for reassurance. My father puffed out his chest, attempting to summon his usual commanding presence. He told me to put the paperwork away and stop ruining the celebration. He called it a temporary cash flow problem. He promised they would just refinance the mortgage on Monday morning. I turned my attention to him. I dismantled his defense with simple arithmetic. I reminded them both that a traditional bank requires verifiable income and a viable credit score. I looked back at my brother. I listed his 2 recent corporate bankruptcies and his sub-500 credit rating. I stated clearly that no underwriter in the state of Arizona would approve a loan for him. I pointed out that my parents had maximized every credit card they owned just to pay for the stakes currently sitting on the table. The illusion shattered in real time. My mother let out a sharp gasp. The reality of her desperate strategy finally caught up to her. Her plan to secure a safety net for her favorite child had instead pushed them all off the financial cliff. She covered her mouth with both hands and began to weep. These were not the manipulative tears she used to solicit my sympathy. This was the visceral panic of a woman realizing she was going to be homeless in less than 2 weeks. My father slumped down into his chair. His tailored jacket suddenly looked too large for his frame. The polished veneer of the wealthy patriarch dissolved, leaving behind a tired man buried in debt. David just stared at the legal notice. His mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. He had built his entire identity on unearned inheritance, and the foundation had just been pulled out from under him. There was no shouting. There was no dramatic music playing in the background to signal a victory. The atmosphere in the room turned instantly toxic. The extended family members, who had just been cheering for David now, looked at their plates in uncomfortable silence. People started checking their watches. The wealthy illusion they had come to celebrate was exposed as a fragile lie. Relatives murmured polite excuses about needing to relieve babysitters or having early morning flights. They stood up and filtered out of the private dining room one by one. They avoided making eye contact with my parents. No one offered to help. No one wanted to stand near the epicenter of a financial collapse. Within 10 minutes, the grand anniversary party was reduced to an empty room littered with half-eaten food and abandoned champagne flutes. I picked up my purse, turned my back on the silent table, and walked out into the warm desert night. The legal process marched forward without any further interference. 11 days later, the house went up for public auction on the steps of the county courthouse. My parents did not show up. David did not show up. A local real estate developer placed the winning bid. The transaction was swift and clinical. The property that held all my childhood memories was sold to a stranger in a matter of minutes. They didn't wait for the formal eviction notice. The shame of the public auction had stripped away my father's last bit of bravado. 3 days after the sale, the sight of a stranger, the new owner's contractor, measuring the front windows for replacement was enough to break them. They packed in a feverish, humiliated silence, stuffing 40 years of life into mismatched cardboard boxes before the sheriff could arrive to escort them out. I watched from down the street, parked out of sight. I watched them carry out the heavy mahogany dining table and their expensive leather sofas. A contractor arrived the very next morning to place a metal lockbox on the front door. The physical structure of my family was officially liquidated. The consequences of my actions were absolute. My parents moved into a cramped 2-bedroom apartment situated right next to a noisy interstate highway. David moved his wife and 3 children into a rented trailer on the outskirts of town. They changed their phone numbers. They did not leave a forwarding address. They severed all contact with me. I was dead to them. The financial boundaries I enforced were interpreted as an unforgivable betrayal. I did not try to reach out. The silence from their end was profound, but it was matched by the emptiness in my own life. Marcus never came back. He sent a mutual friend to collect the rest of his belongings while I was at work. He kept his word. He refused to tie his life to a woman who chose fiscal survival over family loyalty. 2 weeks after the auction, the mail carrier delivered an envelope to my condo. I opened it standing in my kitchen. Inside was a cashier check from the title company. It was the exact amount I was owed. $140,000. My original investment was returned to me in full. I placed the paper on the cold granite island. I looked around my spotless, quiet living room. There were no arguments here. There was no financial bleeding. There was no manipulation. The space was perfectly safe and entirely empty. I had won the war. I had protected my future and recovered my stolen capital. The kitchen was silent, except for that same rhythmic hum of the refrigerator. It was the only voice left in my life. I had cut out the cancer of my family's greed, but I had taken so much healthy tissue with it that I was barely breathing. I was safe, I was solvent, and I was utterly, perfectly alone. The check on the counter was for $140,000. It was the exact price of my childhood home, my relationship with my parents, and my future with Marcus. I had balanced the ledger perfectly. My bank account was full, my boundaries were intact, and my apartment was silent. It was exactly what I asked for. So why did the silence feel like it was screaming? Thank you for listening to my story. If you understand why I did what I had to do, share this with someone who who needs the strength to walk away.